Hey y'all, it's been a minute. Welcome back to the channel. I'm going to do something a little bit different this time. Instead of going through my build of the project and having very long videos, I've actually already completed this project. Please let me know in the comments whether you like this format or me actually doing a longer form. So this actually came from the SFXD Discord community. I'm frequently on the developer focus channels. I think there's Dev and Dev Overflow. So this actually came from that channel. Basically, the problem statement is that he has a project, and each project can have a bunch of project phases. And each of those phases has a start and end date. So the start and end dates they roll up to the project, but each phase has its own subset of start and end date and duration. And each of those phases must be contiguous. So here's one example. So here's an example of a couple of phases within a project. So this is within one project. And we have start, end, and duration. And as you can see, these are all contiguous. The durations are all correct. Now, say a user wants to make a change to phase one. They change the date from January 10th to January 11th. And look how many changes occurred just from that one end date change. The duration on phase one will change to 6. Phase two, since the end date has changed on phase one, the start date must now be 1 day later for phase two, and then the end must also be 1 day later because the duration must stay the same. And of course, this has a cascading effect. Now, phase three, start date is January 23rd when it used to be January 22nd, and the end date then increases by 1 because we want to keep that duration to be 8. Say we change phase three from January 22nd to January 21st. Then this will also have a cascading effect the other way because we want the durations to stay the same. Um, Obviously, duration has changed to 9, right? So this should actually be blue. And then again, phase 2 and phase 1 will be altered accordingly since we want the duration to stay the same. And again, here's a base example. And now if I change the duration, same sort of thing. Changing the duration will change the end date for that phase. It shouldn't touch the start date. And it's basically like changing the end date to January 12th, and then the phase 2 and 3 start and ends change appropriately. The ask within the thread was basically how can I do this via a trigger? And that's just pretty much going down a dead end. Yeah, there is no feedback until after the save. So that's the big issue here. Number one is the ordering of these changes, and more importantly, number two, there is no feedback until after they actually save, and it would just be a huge mess. So what I responded to the person was, so they need to basically visually see the changes within the phases based on the certain changes that they're making within these project phases. And so something that I wanted to build out. So here is the final product. So here I have a scratch work, I have a sample project, and I created this edit phases button. So this is just some sample project phases that I created. As you can see here, they are all contiguous and the durations are correct. Now when I click edit phases, it'll bring up those phases here, and see I change this duration to 6, then December 25th should become December 26th, and all these start and end dates cascade appropriately. And I could also change this here to 27th, and again these things cascade correctly. If I change this duration to 7, then this will change, and this will change. And if I could go backwards, so January 5th to January 4th, then you see the end date and the start date and the start date for phase 1 and phase 2 change appropriately. And the save also works. So 7, 7, 20 are the durations. So 7, 7, and 20 um, are the durations here. And the start and end dates are also correct. So how did I build this? First, just a basic data model. I have a project phase. Very simple. You could have multiple phases per project. The project has a name, start and end date. And the project phase has its own start and end date as well as the duration, which is just a formula field. We only store the start and the end date. And I built an LWC for this, and basically the LWC structure is very simple. We have a project phases editor, and then we have a project phase row edit component, which is a child. There could be multiple of those, and those represent one phase of the project. So going into the LWC, going into VS Code, here is the editor. So the editor HTML itself is pretty simple, again, because it's within a quick action. I have a Lightning quick action panel. If we did want to have this surfaced embedded on the record page itself, then we could sort of like refactor this so that the main editor is its own component, and then we could have a project phases editor quick action, which will then wrap the phases editor component within this quick action panel. But for now, I just added it directly within the quick action panel. And then for each of those phases, I have the child component that renders the project phase itself. Nothing crazy going on here. Within the JavaScript, a couple of things here. Phases, this is the variable that will keep track of any phase changes, and this gets initialized to whatever's in the database. I had to use @track here because I don't know, like the map wasn't really working for this, even though I reassigned the phases variable. I do want to kind of get rid of this @track, but for now I'm going to keep it because it currently doesn't work without it. And some other variables here. First, I have a wire to get the project phases. Since I had the record ID here, that brings that in. And just one note on the naming of these wire methods. What you're doing here with the result is you're processing the result, right? So I see a bunch of like weird names for this method, like get project phases or project phases. Basically, the method is not telling you what is actually happening within it. What it really is doing is processing the result, right? So process get project phases. You could name it process get project phases result, maybe. But since you're already passing in a result, sort of is implied. And so the result has both error and data. So that's why you have the method name like this. And so I assigned it to this variable here. That's more for the refresh apex. I'll explain that a little bit later. And so if the data comes through, we store that in the phases from DB, and then we have post-process phases. I had this here because I am loading a library, day.js, so I did look up a couple of different libraries for date arithmetic. This is the simplest one, and I'm using LowScript, and I have a static resource for that, which is just this. So once I load that script, then I do the post-processing of phases because I need the date arithmetic. I need that library for my post-processing. So if we go into that post-processing, what am I doing here? Basically I'm making sure that everything has been loaded. And then I do this. So from the DB, I initialize that phases variable. I'm using day.js here to convert the start and end date coming from the database because it's going to be a string in YYYY-MM-DD format and converting it to a JavaScript date. So that's what I use day.js here for. Next, I handle any phase change. So the phase changes will be coming in from the row edit, and I'll go over that. But I'm just taking the incoming phase, finding the index. Right now, it's keyed on name. That definitely needs to be fixed. It should be keyed on ID since it's coming from the database. But while I was mocking this out, I was just keying on name, so that definitely needs to change. And I'm getting the old phase just to have it in a variable. And then I'm setting the incoming phase to that array index. And then I'm shifting the prior phases or shifting the subsequent phases based on whether the start or the end date changed on that old phase. And so there's a bunch of like logic in here. I'm not going to go too much into it, but that's pretty much it. Using Super Maven definitely help with this. But here again, I'm using day.js to do some of the math. I feel like this could probably be written a little bit better, but for now, that's how it's written. And then I have a handle save. So I have my phases. I transform that phase object to what Salesforce is expecting. And here you can see that I'm changing the JavaScript date back to the format that Apex wants. And I save the project phases. I had to have this refresh Apex here because when I clicked edit phases multiple times, right? So I say I change something here and I save, and I go back to edit phases again, it will show old data here. And this is needed so that, it's basically just like the Aura method. I think it's called refresh page. I forgot exactly what it's called, but it would refresh, the page that you were looking at. But within LWC, we have get record notify change to do the same thing. And then I just do a toast, and then I close that screen event. And for cancel, just close the screen event. Moving on to the phase row edit. So this represents each phase. So I have the name, I have the duration, start date, and end date. And again, I'm not storing this duration. This thing is basically fake field within my LWC, but I'm never actually storing it. So within my JavaScript file, again, I'm loading my day.js. Going back to here. Yeah, so for each of these inputs, onChange handler. And so for duration, if the duration changes, I get that duration, and I just pass that up to the parent. But I am doing the math within the row edit. So I pass that as well. And then I have the project phases editor, the parent, do the math for any subsequent or prior phases that need to change. So the phase row edit doesn't know anything about the other phases, so it passes the changes for the phase that it is responsible for, and the editor is responsible for the changes to any other phases because of this change. And so at the start and end date, handling the start date change just as this. So the handle date change, what does this do? Basically at the end of the day, it checks whether the start or the end date has changed, finds a diff between those, and gets the duration, and then passes duration start and end date. And yeah, so all that event data is dispatched out to the parent, and then once the parent knows about it, it then makes the changes to the subsequent or prior phases, and all that data actually gets pushed down again to each of those rows. Since I had this at track on phases, and this phases variable is then passed down again into each of those row edits. So then that causes a re-render, and then you see the new data for all the different phases. Just a couple things that aren't implemented that I wanted to highlight. Populating the start and end dates on the project level based on the phase changes hasn't been done. This should be pretty trivial. And adding, deleting project phases from the LWC component. So as you can see here, there's no add button, there's no subtract button. So you cannot delete, you cannot add. So that's currently not implemented. And it may be something that I do at a future point in time. Oh, one other thing that I did want to note is I do have some Apex in here. The Apex doesn't do any sort of manipulation of the data, but what it does is it ensures that the dates between the phases within a project are contiguous. So I do have a project phase trigger handler. Um, Basically, the meat of the code is within this project phase contiguous data validator. So I had that logic encapsulated in a separate class. And basically the validation is, I'm checking all these project phases that have changed, getting the projects that are associated with those project phases, and then I have a helper method here that says, are the phases within that project contiguous? If they are, nothing needs to be done. Otherwise, just add an error. So this will work. So if I'm say an admin and I'm messing with the actual phase outside the LWC. If I make this 1227, this should throw an error right here. Phase dates within a project must be contiguous. You can't do it. You had to use this editor to get it all to work. So there'll be no issues of data integrity because we have the server side Apex checking data that is attempting to be saved. All right, and here's the contiguous stuff here. Nothing crazy. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I think I'll stop here. Hope that was helpful. The link to the GitHub repo I'll post at the description. That is it. I will see you in the next one.